There's something deeply unsettling about a grave that won't stay sealed. It defies the unspoken rule of death itself, that once you're gone, you stay gone. This story took place in a small town in northern Pennsylvania, where the fog clings low and the ground never seems to fully thaw. It happened in a cemetery that most locals avoid after dusk, not because of superstition, but because the ground there moves. The grave in question belonged to a man named Elias Harper. Died in 1971. Nothing particularly remarkable about him. A machinist, never married, no kids. But the cemetery records show something odd. Harper's grave had to be resealed 5 times. The first time was chalked up to the weather. Heavy rains, shifting soil. That's what the groundskeeper told himself. But when he came across Harper's grave the morning after the storm, the dirt had sunk into a perfect oval. Not collapsed, but neatly pulled down, as if something had sucked the soil from beneath. The coffin was exposed. He covered it, tamped it down, reseeded the grass, and moved on. But 2 weeks later, it happened again. No rain this time. No wind. Just a soft depression in the earth and the same neat oval, exposing the edge of the coffin lid. By the 3rd time, the groundskeeper started to document it. He took photographs. He logged the dates and times. But every time he resealed it, the earth came undone, always silently, always overnight. Eventually, he called the town's historical society, thinking maybe there was some kind of underground structure or sinkhole. They sent an inspector. Nothing unusual was found beneath. But here's where things start to get strange. A local woman, Marla Klein, claimed she saw something one night while walking her dog near the cemetery. She described a figure, tall, pale, and dressed in clothes a few decades too old. It stood motionless by the Harper grave, staring at the ground, not acknowledging her at all. When she called out, it turned and disappeared, not walked away, not ran, just blinked out like a television turned off. The next morning, the grave had sunk again. Word spread through the town. People began to leave little offerings by the grave, coins, flowers, even scraps of cloth, not out of reverence, but fear. It was as if the grave demanded to be acknowledged, as if sealing it without ceremony somehow disrespected whatever lay beneath. A retired priest, Father Calloway, took an interest in the case. He visited the grave, walked the perimeter, and performed a quiet blessing. According to his notes, which were later found in his journal, he believed the grave wasn't disturbed from below, but from above. He wrote, "There is a weight pressing upon this grave, but it is not earthly. Something wants this man forgotten, buried not just in earth, but memory." This ties in with a disturbing discovery. Elias Harper had changed his name. Before 1952, he went by Elijah Hart, a name that appears on exactly one document, a record from a sanatorium closed in the late 40s. The report claims Hart was institutionalized for nearly a decade, diagnosed with what they called at the time hallucinated duality. He claimed someone else was living inside him, watching from the inside, whispering to him in sleep, wanting out. He told doctors it would only stop if he died. There's no record of what happened during those 10 years, but what is known is that after he was released, Elias moved to the town, took a job, kept to himself, and died quietly in his home at the age of 52. No cause listed, no autopsy, and yet, even now, over 50 years later, the grave will not remain closed. The groundskeeper, now long retired, refuses to talk about it. But a local teenager who snuck into the cemetery in 2021 swears he saw the coffin lid itself cracked open one night. Not shattered, not decayed, but open from the inside. The boy ran before looking closer. He didn't tell anyone for weeks. When asked what he saw, all he said was, his hands were backwards. Authorities were called. The grave was reburied. Again. But the real mystery is what lies beneath the symbolism. A grave that rejects closure. A man with 2 names. A presence that others can feel but never fully see. Some theorize that Elias was a victim of something ancient, a possession that never truly ended, even in death. That the entity inside him refuses to be buried, or worse, is using the body as a conduit, surfacing every few decades when the seal grows weak. Others suggest the cemetery itself is cursed, a thin place between worlds where death is not a boundary, but a suggestion. There's also a quieter theory that Elias Harper isn't the one disturbing the grave, that something was buried with him, a whisper that survived the decay, a shadow that feeds on the act of remembrance. And every time the earth covers it, it pushes back, reminding us that some things cannot be silenced. The last documented disturbance was in October. It was subtle this time, no depression, no open lid, just a set of footprints, deep and barefoot, leading away from the grave and ending at the cemetery's edge. No entry point, no exit, just the beginning. It started with whispers, not the kind that drift through an old building when the wind squeezes through cracks. These were layered, almost human. They came from the cemetery hill behind St. Evangeline's, a burial ground older than the town itself, dotted with angel statues too worn to remember what they were praying for. Ellie had only just moved into her grandfather's creaky Victorian house after his sudden passing. The house backed up directly to the cemetery, no more than a rusted iron fence between her bedroom window and 1,000 graves. Her grandfather had warned her when she was a child, "Don't talk to the ones beneath the marble angels." She used to laugh at that. It didn't seem so funny now. The first time she heard them, it was 2:14 a.m., not a minute before or after. A faint chorus just below audible comprehension, like a distant crowd murmuring secrets through cupped hands. She thought it was her imagination, maybe the house settling, maybe wine through branches. But when she looked outside, every branch was still. The air was so still it felt like even time had paused. The next night, the voices came again, this time clearer. Not in English, not in any language she recognized, but the cadence felt intentional, ritualistic. She began recording them with her phone. Each night, exactly 2:14 a.m., the whispering never failed. She took the audio to a professor at the local college, Dr. Rahim, an expert in dead languages. He listened quietly, his face draining of color. This is pre-Akkadian, a prayer for the binding of the tone. It was used in burial rites to silence the souls of the restless. Ellie asked why anyone would want to silence the dead. His answer chilled her more than the cemetery ever had, because not all of them are worth listening to. That night, she didn't sleep. She stared out at the cemetery, the moonlight casting long shadows across the marble angels. That's when she noticed something new. One of the statues had turned. It faced her window now, its hands no longer in prayer. They were reaching out. The next day, she returned to the cemetery. She hadn't been inside since the funeral. As she stepped through the rusted gate, the air felt thick, syrupy. Sound dulled, like cotton stuffed in her ears. She walked past rows of ordinary graves before reaching the cluster of angel statues at the far edge. They were older than the others, blackened with age, eroded into eerie grotesques. And at the center, the one that had moved. Its base had no name, only an inscription in Latin, so faint it was barely there. Non vocatus sed auditis. Not called, but heard. She touched the statue's hand. It was warm, not sun-warmed, body-warm. That night, the voices were louder. They weren't whispering anymore. They were chanting. Ellie's recording captured something she hadn't heard with her ears. Her name. Just once in the middle of the chant, clear, urgent, Eleonora. Her full name. No one used that name but her grandfather. Terrified, she considered leaving the house. But something told her it wouldn't matter. The voices didn't belong to the cemetery anymore. They belonged to her. She stopped sleeping, started seeing the statues in her dreams. In each one, they were closer, one step nearer. Sometimes they were inside the house, their marble feet echoing down the wooden halls. She'd wake up with the taste of dust in her mouth and the imprint of stone fingers on her arms. She started researching. The statues were commissioned in 1871 by a grieving widow who had lost all 5 of her children to a fire. She'd had them buried without tongues, and the statues installed to guard their silence. According to a single surviving journal entry, the children had been touched by voices not of this world. The townsfolk believed the widow had gone mad, but when she vanished, leaving behind only burnt pages and a half-melted phonograph. They locked the cemetery gate permanently. It hadn't been reopened until her grandfather moved into the house and had the key cut again. The key was still on his nightstand. That night, Ellie made a choice. She went to the statue with a sledgehammer. She swung once, then twice. On the third hit, the air split like fabric. The whispering stopped. Not faded, stopped. And then, a scream. Not from her. Not human. Something rose from beneath the broken statue. Not visible, not physical, but she felt it. Like gravity had reversed. Like her mind had been cracked open and something ancient was staring through her. She fled the cemetery. The gate slammed shut behind her. The next morning, the statue was whole again. No cracks. No signs it had ever been touched. But the voices stopped. The recordings became static. The angel turned away. And yet, something followed her home. She never hears it anymore, not out loud. But sometimes, when she blinks too slowly, she sees their silhouettes, standing just beyond her vision. Silent, watching. And sometimes, if she listens just right, in the quiet hum of her house, she hears a child's voice say, "Thank you for listening." They called him Mason, though no one was sure if that was his real name. He appeared in town one damp October afternoon, shuffling through the cemetery gates with a knapsack slung over one shoulder and the unmistakable look of a man who hadn't slept in days. He wasn't homeless, not exactly. People saw him with money now and then, buying coffee, cigarettes, even a coat from the thrift store down the street. But he never rented a room, never stayed at the motel. He always returned, without fail, to the cemetery. Every night, without exception, he disappeared into the old gray-stone mausoleum near the center of the grounds. Its ornate stone doors slightly cracked, as though time itself had lost the strength to seal them. At first, the townspeople whispered. Curiosity turned to rumor. Some said he was a squatter. Others thought he was some eccentric historian or maybe an urban explorer. But the groundskeeper, an old man named Eli, had been working those graves for over 30 years, and he knew the Greystone Mausoleum better than anyone. "I locked that place myself," Eli muttered one night at the bar. Rusty iron latch, bolted shut, been sealed for decades. No one's got the key, not even the church. But Mason was still going in. One night, a couple of teenagers, drawn by the usual cocktail of boredom and dares, decided to follow him. They crept past the rusted gates and watched from behind a row of crooked crosses as Mason approached the mausoleum. He didn't unlock the door, didn't pry it open. He just slipped through the crack, like the shadows swallowed him. The kids didn't dare go in. They swore that, as the stone creaked shut behind him, they heard breathing, deep, ragged, and far too close. The next morning, Mason emerged, as usual, calm, composed, but paler than before, eyes sunken, as if he'd spent the night staring at something no human should see. He never spoke of what he did in there, but soon people noticed changes. Birds stopped nesting in the trees surrounding the mausoleum. Flowers left on graves wilted within hours. One of the marble angels adorning the roof lost its head overnight, cleanly severed, though no one heard a sound. And then people started seeing things. A mourner claimed she saw someone watching her from inside the mausoleum. Not Mason, someone else. Someone dressed in early 20th century clothing, with a sunken jaw and white eyes. She fainted right there beside her husband's grave. A week later, a jogger cutting through the cemetery trail reported hearing laughter echoing from the tomb. Childlike and playful at first, then twisted, hollow, like something pretending to be human. By now, Mason had stopped eating. His face gaunt, his body hunched, as if the air around the mausoleum had started pressing down on him. Eli confronted him once, demanded to know what he was doing, why he kept sleeping there. Mason only said one thing: "They don't sleep. And now, neither can I." Then he walked back inside. That was the last time anyone saw Mason in daylight. Weeks passed. Leaves turned black and brittle before they hit the ground. Grave markers near the Greystone plot began to crack. Not from age, but something else. Pressure, as if something underneath wanted out. Then came the storm. A lightning strike hit the cemetery one night, lighting up the sky in silent flashes. Witnesses said the mausoleum glowed, not with fire, but with something cold. Pale blue light oozed from the cracks in the stone, like veins lighting up beneath skin. And Mason stepped out, different. He wasn't wearing his clothes. He was dressed in a black wool suit, old-fashioned, buttoned up to the neck. His eyes, once tired and human, were vacant. Not glowing, just gone. Like his soul had been evicted, and something else had taken its place. He walked straight past the groundskeeper, past the mourning families, and into the woods behind the cemetery. No one saw where he went after that. The next morning, the mausoleum door was shut, completely for the first time in years. And sealed. Not with chains. With stone. Fresh, clean marble, fused seamlessly to the frame, as though the entrance had never been there at all. The cemetery records were checked. There was no Mason listed among the burials. No indication he had family there. The Greystone Mausoleum had belonged to a family wiped out in the 1920s. Mysterious illness, no survivors. Inside that tomb were 4 caskets, but 5 bodies had been buried. Eli never worked the cemetery again. He moved away, quietly, without saying goodbye. But some nights, if you walked through that graveyard around 3 a.m. and you stopped by the Greystone Mausoleum, you might hear something faint. Breathing. Not one set of lungs, but 2. One strained and shallow, the other deep and patient. Waiting. Everyone in the town of Marrow Creek knew to avoid Raven Hollow Cemetery after dark. It wasn't just superstition. It was an unspoken rule, passed down with a kind of grim certainty. Ask any of the old-timers, and they'll tell you, once the sun dips below the hills, you don't go near the iron gates, especially not at midnight. That's when the bell tolls. And no one knows why, because there's no bell tower. It started decades ago. They say back when the cemetery was smaller and the graves were fresher. A caretaker named Ellis took pride in keeping the place tidy. Trimmed hedges, polished headstones, fresh gravel paths. Ellis lived in a small cottage on the edge of the grounds. And on one particularly cold November night, the townsfolk claimed they heard a bell ring out from somewhere deep inside the graveyard. Once, twice, 13 times. That was the last night anyone saw Ellis. The strange thing is, Raven Hollow never had a bell tower. No chapel. No mausoleum with a bell rope. Nothing. At first, the town chalked it up to superstition. Maybe a train bell in the distance. Maybe a prank. But when the bell rang again the next year, on the same night, again at midnight, 13 times, people started to worry. Especially because each year, the sound was followed by something worse. First, it was Ellis. The next year, a woman named Lydia disappeared. She'd been out walking her dog, and the poor animal returned home alone, shaking, its leash frayed and stained. The third year, it was a pair of teenagers who snuck into the cemetery for a dare. Their bikes were found leaned against the fence. Their phones were dead, and the only thing police discovered inside was a single red scarf tied around an old grave that hadn't been touched in over a century. But what truly terrified the town was how the bell started changing. It began ringing even when no one disappeared, sometimes on random nights, never more than once a month. Always at midnight. Always 13 chimes. Some thought it meant someone had narrowly escaped. Others believed it was a warning, a countdown to something worse. One man, a local journalist named Clay Arnett, decided to get to the bottom of it. He'd grown up hearing the stories and had always dismissed them as small-town folklore. But after the 7th or 8th bell toll in just 1 year, he couldn't ignore it. Clay installed motion-sensitive cameras around the perimeter of Raven Hollow and even convinced the police chief to check for underground speakers or old electrical systems. They found nothing. But on the night, Clay decided to stay inside the cemetery himself. Everything changed. He brought gear, infrared lights, audio recorders, even a drone. He wasn't taking any chances. He set up base near the old caretaker's shack, which had long since fallen into disrepair. Midnight came, and the bell rang. 13 slow, heavy tolls. Clay's recording equipment failed the moment the first chime echoed. Lights flickered, batteries drained. But that wasn't what made him run. It was what he saw on the drone's final feed, a grainy black and white image of a figure, not walking, not floating, but gliding across the rows of graves, trailing something long and thin behind it. A rope. And from the center of the cemetery, where no building stood, a thin tower of mist had formed, just tall enough to be a bell tower. Clay ran, leaving everything behind. He never returned to journalism. He refused interviews, moved 3 states away. But every now and then, he sends a Marrow Creek Historical Society an anonymous letter, always dated November, always with a single sentence. The bell still tolls. Then last year, for the first time, the bell rang early. October 31st, Halloween night. The town's new mayor, who'd been pushing to commercialize Raven Hollow with walking tours and seasonal haunted attractions, was found outside the cemetery gates just before dawn. Alive but changed. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't open his eyes, just kept whispering, "It's not a bell, it's a summons." After that, plans for the tours were scrapped. But the story doesn't end there, because just this past week, 5 months early, the bell rang again. Security footage from a nearby gas station caught the audio. 13 chimes, each one followed by what sounded like faint whispers in the static. And then silence. No one's gone missing yet, but the townspeople are restless. Some say the cemetery is expanding, that new graves are appearing on the far edge with no names, just blank headstones, and someone or something is placing fresh flowers on them. Black roses. If you ever find yourself near Marrow Creek, don't go looking for Raven Hollow Cemetery, because the bell doesn't wait anymore. It rings for who it wants, and it's already rung for someone tonight. She walks the graves at 3:13 a.m. That's what the old caretaker at Willowbrook Cemetery warned me the first night I started working there. He didn't say much, just a tired look, a nod toward the deepest part of the graveyard, and a whispered warning I couldn't ignore. I thought it was just a story, something to spook the new guy. But on my 3rd night, everything changed. Willowbrook is an ancient cemetery tucked away on the edge of town. Weathered headstones lean like tired soldiers, and the air carries the scent of damp earth mixed with forgotten memories. At night, it's quiet, too quiet, except for the occasional rustling of dead leaves or the distant call of an owl. I was doing my usual rounds, flashlights slicing through the darkness, when my watch ticked 3:13 a.m. That's when I heard it. Soft footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming from the northern section, where the oldest graves lie, their stones cracked and moss-covered. No animals make sounds like that. It wasn't the wind. It was her. I stopped. The footsteps paused, then resumed, matching my pace, but just out of sight between the crooked tombstones. Curiosity pulled me forward. Between the shadows, I saw her. A woman, dressed in white, moving quietly among the graves. Her long hair flowed like smoke, and her feet barely seemed to touch the ground. She didn't look alive, but she wasn't entirely dead either. I blinked, and she vanished. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, exhaustion playing with my mind. But the next night, at 3:13 a.m. sharp, she returned. This time, I followed her path. She moved with purpose, stopping at certain graves, her pale fingers brushing the weathered stone as if she were searching for something lost long ago. One grave stood out. Fresh. The name on the tombstone was faded, but readable, Lillian Gray, 1892 to 1915. I crouched closer, examining the dates. She couldn't have been more than 23 when she died. A young woman, like the one I'd seen. Could it be her? Suddenly, a cold breeze wrapped around me like icy fingers. The woman turned. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to pull me in, endless and empty. Without a word, she mouthed, "Find me." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The following days, I dove into the cemetery's history, digging through old records and newspapers. I learned that Lillian Gray was a local girl who had disappeared mysteriously one autumn night. Some said she was murdered, others whispered of darker things. Curses, restless spirits, and unfinished business. No one ever found her body. Her grave was an empty monument, erected by a grieving family who never got closure. Back in the cemetery, I found myself drawn to Lillian's stone every night. At exactly 3:13 a.m., she appeared, silently wandering, waiting. Her presence was both heartbreaking and haunting, a spirit trapped between worlds. One night, I brought a small bouquet of white lilies, hoping to offer some peace. As I placed the flowers at the base of her grave, the air grew heavy. The ground trembled slightly beneath my feet. She appeared once more, closer than ever. This time, her eyes weren't empty, they were pleading. I reached out instinctively. My hand passed through her like smoke, but a whisper brushed my ear. "Help me." From that moment, I realized her story wasn't just a tragic ending. It was a call for justice. Determined, I promised to uncover the truth and set her free. But the deeper I went into Lillian's past, the more I felt something watching me, something that didn't want her story told. Shadows shifted in the dark corners of the cemetery, and the temperature dropped without warning. Every night at 3:13 a.m., she walks the graves, waiting for someone to hear her. And I fear that if I fail, I might join her in that endless, silent wandering forever. There's an old cemetery on the outskirts of a small town, a place locals rarely visit after dusk. Known as Hollow Pines, it's surrounded by dense woods that swallow the fading light, and on certain nights, the thick fog rolls in like a living thing, slow, silent, and suffocating. For decades, the cemetery had one constant presence, an elderly gardener named Elias. Elias was a quiet man, a fixture among the moss-covered stones and twisted iron fences. He knew every inch of the grounds, tending to the weeping willows, pruning the roses, and raking the fallen leaves with almost ritualistic care. Townsfolk said he had an uncanny connection to the dead, as if he spoke to them in whispers no one else could hear. On an unusually foggy October evening, Elias set out for his usual rounds just before sundown. The mist was already thick, curling between the graves like spectral fingers. No one saw him leave, but the next morning, Elias was gone, vanished without a trace. The rakes and shears were left abandoned near the oldest crypt, and the air still carried the faint scent of damp earth and wilting flowers. Search parties combed the woods and the cemetery grounds for days. But there was no sign of Elias, no footprints, no disturbed leaves beyond his last known location, not even a whisper in the thickening fog. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Some say the fog claimed him, pulling him into a shadow world between the living and the dead. Others claim Elias had discovered something ancient buried beneath hollow pines, something that didn't want to be disturbed. Weeks later, a group of teenagers dared to explore the cemetery after dark, hoping to find clues or at least catch a glimpse of the mysterious fog. They found the gardener's shed open, tools neatly arranged but coated in a fine layer of moisture. Among the clutter was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. The entries were filled with meticulous notes about the cemetery's plants, but towards the end, the tone shifted. Elias wrote about strange noises echoing through the fog, shadows moving without form, and whispers just beyond comprehension. One entry described a strange symbol etched into the stone of a forgotten grave, a mark that seemed to glow faintly in the mist. According to Elias, the symbol was not a name, but a warning. It spoke of a guardian, a watcher who dwelled in the fog and protected the secrets buried beneath the cemetery. The gardener's final note was a chilling plea, a warning not to disturb the dead or risk vanishing as he had. After the teenagers left the journal in the town's small museum, the fog seemed thicker than ever during October nights. And sometimes, late at night, the cemetery's groundskeepers swear they hear the soft scrape of a rake, followed by a fading silhouette disappearing into the mist, a silent echo of the gardener who vanished into the fog. Lot 47 was a quiet corner of Maplewood Cemetery, far from the main path, hidden beneath the skeletal arms of ancient oaks. Most visitors never found their way there, and that was just how the caretakers liked it. They whispered about strange things happening in Lot 47, things too unsettling to mention in daylight. Rumors swirled about midnight screams, unexplained shadows, and the chilling feeling that something or someone was still very much alive in those graves. The story begins with a local groundskeeper named Thomas, a man known for his stoic nature and deep respect for the dead. He had worked at Maplewood for nearly a decade, his days filled with trimming hedges, clearing leaves, and repairing worn tombstones. Yet, despite his years of experience, he never dared enter Lot 47 after dusk. Something about that place felt off, as if the earth itself whispered warnings he couldn't ignore. One autumn evening, as a cold wind rattled the bare branches overhead, Thomas received an urgent call from the cemetery office. A grave had sunk unevenly in Lot 47, a dangerous hazard that needed immediate attention before visitors arrived the next day. Though hesitant, Thomas grabbed his tools and made his way down the cracked stone steps leading to the forgotten section. As he approached the site, the fading light cast long, distorted shadows across the cracked headstones. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp soil, and something far more elusive, fear. Thomas knelt beside the disturbed grave, noticing the fresh earth was oddly loose, as if something beneath struggled to escape. Suddenly, a sharp, blood-curdling scream shattered the stillness. It wasn't distant. It came from right beneath him, as if the very ground was crying out in pain. Thomas froze, heart pounding, unsure whether the sound was real or a trick of his mind. But then the scream came again, low, guttural, filled with despair. He stumbled back, fumbling for his flashlight. The beam cut through the growing darkness, illuminating a section of earth that seemed to shift and pulse. At the edge of his vision, Thomas glimpsed a shadow, fleeting, indistinct, retreating into the deeper soil. Determined to uncover the truth, Thomas dug cautiously around the grave. His fingers brushed against something cold and unnatural beneath the surface. As he unearthed more soil, he found not bones, but a rusted metal box, sealed tight with old chains. Puzzled, Thomas dragged the box into the open and pried it loose. Inside, wrapped in decayed cloth, was a bundle of letters and a small wooden figure carved with strange symbols. The letters, yellowed and brittle, told a story of forbidden love and a desperate pact made long ago, a pact that trapped a tormented soul beneath Lot 47. According to the letters, a man named Elias had fallen in love with a woman deemed unacceptable by the village. Fearing they would be separated forever, Elias turned to dark rituals, hoping to bind their souls beyond death. But the ritual backfired, imprisoning Elias's spirit in the earth, forever screaming in anguish. As Thomas read the final words, a cold gust swept through the cemetery, carrying with it a faint whisper, "Free me." The ground trembled beneath him once more. Thomas realized the screams were not just echoes from the past. They were warnings, a desperate plea trapped between life and death. The story of Lot 47 is more than just a chilling tale. It's a reminder of the thin line that separates the living from the dead and the restless souls who linger in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. There's a small cemetery tucked away behind an old church, known only to a few locals as Maplewood. The kind of place where the fog clings to the earth like a cold breath, and the trees whisper secrets that only the dead can understand. Among the rows of weathered stones and cracked statues stood a peculiar tombstone, one that seemed to have a life of its own. It wasn't just its appearance that unsettled people. No, this tombstone had a strange reputation. Every few weeks, the name inscribed on it would change. At first, it was thought to be a prank. The letters, carved deep into the granite, were said to shift overnight, as if rearranged by unseen hands. One evening, the name read Elizabeth Marrow, a woman who supposedly died in the 1800s. A few weeks later, the letters were replaced by Jonathan Crane, a man who, records showed, had been buried in the same cemetery nearly a century later. What made this phenomenon even stranger was the fact that none of the other gravestones ever changed. Only this one, worn, moss-covered, and surrounded by an unsettling stillness. Locals started to avoid the area around the stone, sharing hushed rumors about curses and restless spirits. The story spread to urban explorers and ghost hunters, but none could explain how or why the tombstone changed names. One autumn night, a man named David decided to investigate. David was a skeptic, a history teacher who didn't believe in ghost stories. He wanted to prove it was all a trick, vandalism, weather erosion, something explainable. Equipped with a flashlight and camera, he made his way into Maplewood after dusk. As he approached the mysterious stone, the air grew inexplicably colder. His breath hung in the darkness like mist. The cemetery, usually quiet except for the occasional owl, now seemed alive with whispers just beyond hearing. David examined the tombstone closely. The name etched into the granite had changed again. This time, it read Miriam Blackwood, a woman David had never heard of. He circled the stone, shining his light over every inch, trying to find signs of tampering. But the granite was smooth, the engraving perfect. No scratches, no tool marks. Just a name, clear and precise. Curiosity compelled him to research the name Miriam Blackwood. Back at home, David dug through old records and newspapers. He discovered Miriam had been a nurse who died tragically young during the 1918 flu pandemic. But strangely, no record of her burial existed in Maplewood Cemetery. The next night, David returned to the cemetery, hoping to find more clues. This time, he arrived just before midnight. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting an unnatural darkness over the stones. As he stood by the tombstone, the name suddenly began to shift before his eyes. The letters blurred and melted like ink bleeding on paper. Then, chillingly, a new name emerged, David Miller. His own name. David froze. A cold wave of dread washed over him. The air thickened, and he felt an invisible pressure pressing down on his chest. A voice, soft but urgent, whispered from the shadows. "You belong here now." He spun around, but no one was there. Panic rising, David tried to pull himself away, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. His flashlight flickered and died. Darkness enveloped him. In that moment, the tombstone's surface glowed faintly with an eerie blue light. The name David Miller pulsed slowly, as if alive. David's mind raced. Was it a hallucination? Some elaborate trick of the light? Suddenly, memories flooded his mind. Not his own, but someone else's. A life he had never lived. He saw a woman lying in a hospital bed, coughing and fading. He saw a funeral shrouded in black veils, mourners weeping silently. He saw himself, not as the man he knew, but as a ghostly figure standing by this very tombstone, waiting. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping in a chilling chorus, calling him to join them. In desperation, David turned to flee but stumbled, crashing to the ground. The last thing he saw was the name on the tombstone shifting again. Now it read David Miller, followed by the chilling inscription beneath. Rest eternal until remembered. From that night on, David was never seen again. His belongings were found scattered near the cemetery entrance, but no sign of him inside. The tombstone, however, remained. And the name? It changed once more. It was a night thick with fog, the kind that wraps around trees and seeps into your skin, chilling you even if the air itself feels still. Briar Lane, a forgotten stretch of road winding through an old town, had long been the subject of whispered rumors. They said the dead didn't always stay buried there, and sometimes, on nights like this, the veil between worlds thinned just enough for the restless to cross back. Jacob had never believed those stories. Cemetery legends were just that, stories told by old-timers to scare kids and keep the curious away. But curiosity was exactly what drove him to Briar Lane that night. He had been researching the town's history for a project, and the cemetery was a gold mine of forgotten names and faded memories. But what caught his attention was an odd entry in the town records, a funeral held on Briar Lane in the dead of night, nearly a century ago, that had no trace of a body, no tombstone, no mention in local newspapers. It was as if the funeral never happened. Yet multiple eyewitness accounts described seeing a mournful procession moving silently through the fog, disappearing into the woods beyond the cemetery. Jacob decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and his camera, he parked his car at the entrance to the cemetery and stepped into the fog. The silence was overwhelming. No crickets, no rustling leaves, only the soft crunch of his footsteps on the gravel path. The gravestones loomed like silent sentinels, their engravings worn by time. He found the oldest section of the cemetery and noticed something strange. There was a clear path leading away from the graves into the dense forest, almost like a trail carved through the undergrowth. As he followed the path, a sudden chill wrapped around him, colder than the night air. His breath puffed out in small clouds. Then, faintly at first, he heard it, a soft melody, like a funeral dirge played on an old pipe organ, carried by the wind. Jacob's heart quickened. The sound grew clearer, a slow, mournful procession of music and footsteps. Then, through the fog, he saw them, figures draped in black, moving slowly and solemnly down Briar Lane. But something was wrong. Their feet never touched the ground. The procession glided silently, their faces hidden beneath hoods, and their shapes flickered like shadows caught between two worlds. Frozen, Jacob raised his camera, snapping pictures. The flash lit up the spectral scene for a split second. He saw the pallbearers carrying a coffin, its surface shimmering and translucent, as if made of mist. The procession passed right through him. Jacob's body felt numb, as if time itself had slowed. The mourners didn't acknowledge him. They were bound to their eternal ritual, trapped in a loop of grief and loss. Suddenly, the music stopped. The figures faded into the fog, leaving Jacob alone in the silence. His camera beeped. A photo was captured, but when he checked it, the image was just a blur, a swirl of gray and black. Shaken, Jacob made his way back to the cemetery entrance. But as he passed the oldest gravestone, he noticed fresh flowers laid at its base. Bright, alive, utterly impossible on a night like this. He bent down to read the name, Eleanor Mayfield, 1892 to 1918. The same woman rumored to be the one buried in the phantom funeral. Jacob never returned to Briar Lane, but the haunting image of that procession stayed with him. An echo of sorrow, of a funeral lost to time, forever wandering the fog. And some nights, when the wind carries the right sound, the town still hears the soft footsteps of the phantom funeral procession drifting silently along Briar Lane. There are places where the veil between the living and the dead thins. Places where shadows move just a little too deliberately, as if they carry the weight of forgotten secrets. One such place was an old, neglected cemetery at the edge of a small town named Black Hollow. The locals called it Whispering Pines, but no one dared say the name out loud after dusk. It started with the groundskeeper, a quiet man named Elias. He had tended the cemetery for decades, his life marked by the rhythm of seasons and the soft fall of leaves on cracked tombstones. Elias was a man of routine, always the first to arrive at dawn, always the last to leave at twilight. Yet, in his final years, a strange restlessness began to haunt him. One chilly autumn evening, Elias was closing up the small chapel when he noticed something unusual near the oldest section of the cemetery. Lot 13, an area avoided by visitors and often shrouded in thick fog, even on clear nights. A deep pit had appeared in the freshly turned earth, perfectly rectangular, its edges sharp as if carved by careful hands. No fresh graves had been scheduled there, and Elias had not dug any holes that day. Curious, he leaned over the pit. The air was thick and damp, smelling of moss and something older, something decayed yet untouched by time. At the bottom of the pit, faint movements stirred. Shadows twisted against the pale moonlight, as though something was writhing beneath the surface. Elias backed away slowly, his heart pounding. That night, sleep eluded him. The image of the pit haunted his mind, accompanied by a subtle, rhythmic sound. The scrape of dirt being moved, the slow, dragging noise of something digging itself deeper. The next morning, Elias returned to Lot 13 with a lantern and a shovel, determined to find answers. But the pit was gone. In its place was a fresh grave, a new tombstone carved with no name, no dates, only a simple, ominous engraving, a silhouette of a figure, half-formed, almost like a shadow. Elias stared, unable to move. Over the following days, strange happenings plagued the cemetery. Visitors reported glimpses of a shadow moving just beyond their vision, a shape that seemed human but never fully took form. Some said they heard scraping noises at night, like claws clawing at earth. Others felt an oppressive chill, as if the very air around the graves was growing heavy with unseen sorrow. Elias found himself drawn back to the grave, night after night, watching from a distance as the shadow grew bolder, moving among the tombstones, tracing invisible paths. One evening, he swore the shadow looked back at him, eyes dark pits, devoid of light but filled with something desperate. Unable to bear the silence, Elias spoke aloud one night. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The shadow paused and tilted its head as if listening. In that moment, Elias felt a flood of memories, not his own but someone else's. A man who had lived long ago, condemned by guilt and regret, doomed to wander the earth for an unforgivable crime. This shadow was the man's fractured soul, forever digging its own grave as punishment. But there was more. The shadow was not only a prisoner, it was a warning. Elias realized that long before his time, the cemetery had been the site of a terrible betrayal, a man buried alive by those he once trusted. His spirit had refused peace, digging to escape, but only succeeded in burying himself deeper. Elias's nights grew restless, and he began to hear whispers in the wind, voices pleading for release, for justice. The shadow was trying to communicate, but the story had been lost to time, obscured by silence and fear. One stormy night, Elias found himself at the edge of Lot 13 once again. The shadow appeared before him, clearer than ever, a man shaped entirely from darkness, clawing at the dirt with agonized hands. Without thinking, Elias began to dig. The earth was cold and heavy, but he dug with purpose, driven by a force beyond understanding. As dawn broke, the grave was complete, empty save for a small, weathered box buried deep inside. Inside the box was a letter, yellowed with age. It spoke of betrayal, names of those who had condemned the man to death by burial, and a plea for the truth to be revealed. Elias realized the shadow had been digging its own grave, but also trying to dig up the past, to force the living to remember what had been forgotten. From that day forward, the shadow never returned. The cemetery seemed lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. Visitors noticed the air no longer carried the oppressive chill. The whispers stopped. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the wind carries a faint scratching sound, the old groundskeeper's warning echoes quietly. Some graves aren't meant to be left alone. Some shadows dig their own graves, but the secrets they unearth can still haunt the living. There's something unnerving about cemeteries at night, but what makes the story of the old Miller family plot so chilling isn't just the darkness. It's what people say they see lurking behind one particular headstone. Locals have whispered about it for decades, and those who've dared to stay after sunset report a feeling of being watched, eyes staring from the cold stone itself. The Miller plot is an ancient part of the town's cemetery, shadowed by overgrown oaks and tangled ivy. It's marked by a large granite headstone with the name Eleanor Miller etched deep into its surface. Eleanor died nearly a century ago, but the stories about her grave are very much alive. It all started with a cemetery caretaker named James. He was a quiet man who kept to himself, working the grounds for years without incident. But one autumn evening, he told a chilling tale to a group of friends that changed everything. James had been finishing his rounds just after dark when he noticed a faint glimmer coming from the Miller headstone. At first, he thought it was a trick of the moonlight, but as he drew closer, he saw something impossible. Two small, bright eyes reflected back at him, just above the engraved name. Frozen, James blinked, and the eyes vanished. He swore they weren't animal eyes or reflections, but something else, something alive. The next day, he asked the town historian about Eleanor Miller. What he learned only deepened the mystery. Eleanor had been a young woman who died tragically in her 20s, under circumstances no one fully understood. Some said she was heartbroken. Others whispered of darker secrets, fears of a curse, or a restless spirit bound to the grave. No official records explained why her burial was so unusual, but those who visited the site felt an inexplicable chill, especially near the headstone. James returned that night, determined to see if the eyes would appear again. Hours passed, silence pressing down on him like a weight, until the moment the clock struck midnight. Suddenly, a pair of eyes emerged, cold, unblinking, and glowing faintly, fixed on him from behind the stone. But this time, the eyes weren't alone. Shadows shifted around the grave, almost as if something was trying to break free from the earth itself. James fled, breath ragged, promising never to return after dark. The story spread, attracting curiosity seekers and ghost hunters. Most dismissed the sightings as tricks of the light or overactive imaginations, but a few confessed to glimpsing the eyes and felt an oppressive dread they couldn't shake. One amateur investigator named Claire decided to spend a night at the Miller plot with a camera, hoping to capture proof of the phenomenon. As midnight approached, her footage showed faint wisps of shadow twisting around the headstone, then the unmistakable glint of eyes appearing from the darkness. But what Claire didn't expect was the overwhelming feeling that those eyes were watching not just her, but through her, peering into her thoughts, probing her fears. Her recordings ended abruptly when she screamed and dropped the camera. The last frames revealed a distorted figure, barely visible behind the stone, eyes burning with something ancient and angry. No one ever explained what those eyes were, or why they remained behind Eleanor Miller's headstone. Some believe it's her spirit, trapped and trying to communicate or warn those who come too close. Others whisper a darker truth, that the eyes belong to something older than Eleanor, something that waits beneath the stone, watching patiently, forever hungry for a glimpse of the living. Since then, the cemetery has become a place avoided by most after sundown. The Miller headstone stands silent, but for those who listen closely, the eyes behind it never truly close. There's a place in every town that no one talks about, where shadows seem to linger a little longer and the cold bites deeper. In the outskirts of a small, forgotten village stood the old Greystone Cemetery, ancient, overgrown, and whispered to be cursed. For generations, the locals avoided it after sunset, and for good reason. The story begins with a man named Elias Crow, a name that echoed in hushed tones whenever the topic of Greystone came up. Elias wasn't a criminal by nature. He was a historian, obsessed with uncovering lost artifacts and relics from the past. But his curiosity twisted into something darker when he learned of a rumor, a hidden crypt beneath Greystone, said to hold a secret so valuable that it could rewrite history. Elias arrived one cold autumn night, the wind swirling dead leaves around his feet as he crossed the iron gates that groaned like a warning. He was not a stranger to graveyards, but this night felt different. The air was thick, not with mist, but something heavier, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He found the old caretaker's map in the town archives, a crumpled paper yellowed with age. It marked a spot near the oldest part of the cemetery, a crypt sealed for centuries, its entrance buried beneath a cracked headstone engraved with a name no one remembered, Jonathan Blackwood. Elias dug with determination, his tools scraping against stone and soil. As the moonlight waned, he uncovered the crypt's iron door, rusted but intact. Heart pounding, he forced it open, releasing a breath of stale, cold air that smelled of forgotten time. Inside was darkness, so thick it swallowed his flashlight's beam hole. His footsteps echoed against the damp stone walls, and somewhere deep inside, A faint whisper seemed to brush past his ear, a sound so soft he almost questioned if it was real. Deeper into the crypt, Elias found what he sought. A chest, ornately carved with symbols that didn't belong to any known language. The chest trembled slightly, as if breathing, and when he lifted the lid, an ancient book lay inside, bound in leather cracked by age. Pages yellowed and brittle held secrets in ink faded almost to invisibility. As Elias flipped through the pages, he began to read aloud the strange incantations and names. Words that felt wrong on his tongue, like they were not meant for the living. The air grew colder, and a shadow flickered just beyond the beam of his light. The whispers grew louder, no longer a distant murmur, but an urgent hiss pressing against his sanity. Suddenly, the crypt door slammed shut behind him. Panic surged through Elias as he tried to open it. Rust and age had sealed it tight. The whispers turned into low chanting, surrounding him, pulling at the edges of his mind. Days later, the townsfolk found his body just outside the cemetery gates. Elias was alive but silent, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if seeing something no one else could. His lips moved in faint, desperate murmurs. His last whisper, some said, was a warning. They say that when the wind blows through Greystone Cemetery now, you can hear the faint sound of chanting and a voice, barely audible, repeating the same words Elias read from that cursed book. The grave robber's last whisper has become a haunting melody, one that no one dares to understand. What Elias uncovered was never meant for the living. The crypt did not just guard a secret. It held a curse, a warning etched in shadows and silence. The grave robber's final breath was swallowed by the darkness he tried to steal from, and the secret remains buried, waiting for the next curious soul to listen to its last whisper. There's something undeniably unsettling about unmarked graves. Without a name, a date, or even a symbol to identify who lies beneath, they become shadows of mystery in a sea of silent stone. But sometimes the silence itself is broken by whispers that shouldn't be heard. It started with a dare. A group of college friends decided to explore an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, one that had been closed for decades. Among the winding paths and crumbling tombstones, they found a small, weathered crypt, one that had no plaque or inscription. Just a heavy iron door, rusted shut, tucked beneath twisted oaks and choking ivy. The oldest tale about this crypt was simple. Nobody knew whose it was. The cemetery records made no mention of it. The locals whispered that it belonged to someone who was never supposed to be buried there, a forgotten soul, perhaps cursed, or worse, someone who should have stayed dead. Against better judgment, the friends returned at night. One of them managed to pry open the iron door with a crowbar, and the smell hit them immediately, a mix of damp earth, decay, and something else they couldn't quite place. Inside was cold, colder than it should have been for an empty stone chamber. As they shone their flashlights inside, they saw nothing but shadows. Yet, just as they were about to leave, a faint sound floated out, a whisper, low and broken, like breath carried through cracked lips. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the whispers didn't fade with the breeze. They grew louder, clearer, soft words impossible to understand, but undeniably human. One friend, braver or more foolish than the rest, stepped closer. His light caught something in the corner, a small wooden box covered in dirt and cobwebs. When he opened it, an ancient diary fell out. The leather was cracked, the pages brittle, but the handwriting was sharp and desperate. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who lived more than a century ago. Her entries told a story of grief and madness. She had buried her child in secret, in this unmarked crypt, after the town refused her family's plea to use a proper graveyard. Her words spiraled from sorrow to obsession, hinting that her child's spirit never found peace. That's when the whispers changed. They weren't just voices, they were cries, pleading for release. The friends felt cold breath on their necks, saw flickers of shadow moving just beyond their sight. Panicked, they tried to close the crypt, but the door slammed shut on its own, trapping them inside. The whispers turned into a chant, a mournful lullaby that seemed to echo from the very walls. One by one, the friends felt an unbearable sadness seep into their minds, memories of loss and loneliness that were not their own. They were drawn to the box and Eleanor's diary, as if compelled to finish her final entry. With trembling hands, the bravest read aloud the last lines, words Eleanor had never dared to speak out loud, a plea to the child's spirit to be free at last. Suddenly, the air shifted. The chanting stopped. The door creaked open, releasing them into the cold night. They never spoke of what happened again, but none of them could forget the whispers, or the feeling that some secrets buried in unmarked crypts are meant to stay silent forever.